Welcome back. So at the start of the day, we asked you our question of the day today relates to the land question. And our question was regarding the expropriation of unused private land without compensation. And we asked you, what is your opinion regarding expropriation of unused private land without compensation? And let's just take a quick look at your responses, what your views are on this matter. Tavera says, people must understand that when we are doing farming, the soil became exhausted. Also, so farmers can leave the land for 10 to 15 years for better yield. So people must wait for the government to do some research and relocate people. Kagiso says we should be expropriating all this land without compensation. It's stolen property after all. Why are we being nice to land thieves? That's Kagiso. Canisto says, as long as it doesn't belong to farming, I can give it to you. But if it's for farming purposes, I will fight with you. Good morning to the crew there. Good morning to you too, Canisto. And then the logic says that no one will tolerate legally stealing a man's hard work, blood, sweat and tears. Rather land expropriation with compensation, no conflict, repercussions averted. And those are some of your tweets on this particular matter. Well, last week, revelation surfaced that the Gauteng province would be expropriating unused privately owned land without compensation. And this despite the ongoing process by Parliament's Constitutional Review Committee to look into the redistribution of this matter. And of course, this is what we will be discussing right now to find out whether there are any conflicts with regard to what's happening in Parliament and what's happening here in Gauteng. And to discuss this further, we're joined now by Edward Molopi, who's a research and advocacy officer at the Socio-Economic Rights Institute. Thanks for coming through, Edward.
No, thanks for having me, Sakina.
So that first question, is there a conflict with what Gauteng is doing right now and the process unfolding in Parliament?
Well, not necessarily, because the state needs to go on with its actions. So it needs to go on implementing whatever policies that they have taking place. So discussions that take place in Parliament don't necessarily hinder the state from proceeding with the plans that they have in place. Only when Parliament has reached a particular decision or they implement a particular policy or enact an act, which would maybe revert or change what actions are currently taking place right now. But as things stand, there hasn't been anything that Parliament has said. It's still taking on having discussions, so the state can continue to administer whatever policies that are in place.
So we have Section 25, and one could say that Gauteng now is testing Section 25 of the Constitution in its current form without the proposed amendments that Parliament is seeking to effect. So with regard to what Gauteng has now announced of basically taking on the disused or vacant land from privately owned patches, what would you make of that? Do you think the Gauteng government is within their rights to do that?
Well, it's actually something that they should have been considering and doing for a very long time. I think a lot of misconceptions that have come with Section 25 is that it only looks at property owners and only seeks to guarantee their rights. But then there's also a lot of redistribution that you can actually read out of Section 25. So the expropriation, that it's already there in Section 25 in its current form. So the issue was actually whether for a long time that hasn't been tested as to what it allows and what people can do with its current form. And so what they're doing now is actually, I think, testing it out to see what it can allow in terms of redistribution and expropriating in its current form.
Edward, I think what makes a lot of people nervous about this is if you look at what it says, you will be expropriating a privately owned land and facilities even. So when it is privately owned, it suggests that, you know, someone actually has the title deed to this and is therefore the owner thereof. So how does government then go about expropriating that land without compensation?
Well, currently I think what needs to happen is, so the Constitution in its current form allows for expropriation, right? But then what it also says is that there are a number of considerations that the state needs to take into place when expropriating that particular land. So compensation is one of the considerations that are currently in place, but also other issues that are currently in place is what the land is being used for, how it's being used, how it was acquired, what kind of investment the state put into that land. So looking at all those considerations, then they can move on to say that we need this particular land for what the Constitution refers to as public interest. So maybe there's a huge parcel of land that's not being used, and that land is needed for housing, for example.
Someone may even question that, to say, what do you mean by unused land?
Mm-hmm. So that's I mean, I think it's, so in some instances you find that people will hold land for speculative reasons, so hoping that after 5 to 10 years that land will acquire it would gain value, so they hold on to the land for that. But then also you have people who have land, but there's nothing happening on that land. There's no farming, there's no infrastructure being put in place. So it's just land that's there, has not been used for any number of years, but it's laying there.
So would there be a specific number of years that land would have to have been fallow, or, you know, I mean, what sort of stipulations do you need to follow? Yeah,
there isn't any. I mean, I think it's something that would be tested out in court also as to that, but there isn't a specific duration that I'm aware of that one needs to say that. But I think maybe policies or acts that are put in place would then say that. So the Constitution is like a broad framework, but then there needs to be like legislation that comes in to give like meat to that. And so some of those would be coming to explain what they would have meant by that.
So in other words, you're saying, because I was wondering about the whole process that you would need to embark upon, so you're saying that a lot of this will actually become test cases in court?
So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what they are looking to do with this. But I think the idea, the argument is that you are wanting to change or amend the Constitution, but you haven't actually worked with the current framework. So work with the current framework, and if it happens that it blocks redistribution, it blocks what we need to do, then we can come and amend. But for now, I think the argument is that the amendment is premature.
So one of the other questions and one of the criticisms that people would put forward is that why doesn't government start with the tracts of land that it owns currently?
That's, yeah, I mean, I think we need to look at it holistically, right? So whether it's state-owned land, we need to look at how big the state-owned land is, how big privately owned land is, and then from there have that kind of discussion as to who owns what kind of land, where is that land located. Because sometimes the argument is that land that is productive is actually not in the hands of the state, but some would argue otherwise. So we need to have a look at all that land and see where that land is located and who owns it, and then from there have that kind of discussion.
So just from, you know, a legal perspective, would it weaken or would it strengthen the state's case to actually start with their own land first in terms of, redistributing that first before you say we don't have land now, we're going to expropriate whatever is unused in this instance?
Well, I would imagine that they would need to say that we have this particular plans, we have these plans in place. And for us to execute these plans, we need these kind of resources, land being one of those resources, and saying that of the land that we have, this is what we are able to use, and this is how we plan to use it. But then there is land that is not currently available to us. If that's the argument that they make, that we have land that is currently unavailable to us, and we need to acquire that particular land in order to fulfill the plans that we have. So if the planning is such that it encompasses land that is outside of the state's hold, then the state can say that that land is needed for us to execute the plans that we currently have in the public interest.
Edward Molopi, thanks so much for stopping by this morning. It's going to be an interesting one. It's going to be interesting to see where the Gauteng government actually starts with this particular process. And as Edward Molopi says, more likely than not that we will see some court cases ensue as a result of this. Well, it's time for the news.